da 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 da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da.
Oh, Iowa, known for its corn and corn. But if you delve into the history of this unassuming state, you'll see a place rich in culture, heritage, or flavor. Okay, I might be wrong about that, but let's just begin. The history of Iowa as we know it started around 60 million years ago when Laurentia, the predecessor to North America, split away from Eurasia. Then, roughly 30 million years ago, the Mississippi River would be formed, which, as some of you might know, borders Iowa. Then after that, kind of chilled for a while until humans arrived in the Americas around 15,000 years ago, and touched Iowa's land 2,000 years later. Now, first, these native Iowans lived a hunter-gatherer lifestyle until they developed agriculture around 800 AD. Around the same time, the Oneota culture came into fruition. The Oneota, an Upper Mississippian culture, lasted from 900 AD all the way to 1650 AD. The Oneota cultivated things like corn, beans, and squash, as well as hunting fish, deer, and bison. They primarily lived in large villages like the other Mississippian cultures. Eventually, other tribes like the Dakota Sioux and the Iowa moved into its territory. The territory of Iowa was first discovered by Europeans in 1673, when Jacques Marquette and Louis Joliet traveled down the Mississippi River. Iowa was shortly claimed by France as a part of the Louisiana Territory of the New France colony in 1682. Although it never really had a major settlement due to low amounts of colonists immigrating to New France, whom were mostly ex-soldiers and priests. By 1750, the entirety of New France, which included Canada and the Louisiana Territory, only had 70,000 people. In comparison, the 13 colonies, which were much smaller, had a population of around 2 million. In 1763, France was forced to cede Louisiana, including Iowa, to the Spanish Empire after the 7 Years' War. Although the Spanish didn't have much of an impact on Iowan history. However, in 1785, French-Canadian fur trader Julien Dubuc settled in the area of Iowa on the banks of the Mississippi, establishing what would be Iowa's oldest city, Dubuque. About 40 years later, in 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte signed the Treaty of San Ildefonso with Spain, thus returning the Louisiana Territory to France. Bonaparte sold the entire Louisiana Territory to the recently formed United States of America for $15 million. Shortly after, between 1804 and 1806, Meriwether Lewis and James Clark set off to explore the lands of the Louisiana Territory. And, in 1808, Fort Madison, the first military fort to be built in the upper Mississippi, was built in the southeastern corner of Iowa. When the U.S. government bought the lands of eastern Iowa from the Fox and Sauk tribes living there, settlers began moving rapidly into the area. Dubuque from earlier was incorporated in 1833, and other cities like Burlington, Davenport, and Muscatine also sprang up in the 1830s. Then, in 1838, the Iowa Territory was officially established, beginning Iowa as we know it today. At the time, the Iowa Territory only had a population of around 23,000. Des Moines, which would decades later become Iowa's capital, was founded in 1844 when a military fort was placed in between the Des Moines and Raccoon Rivers. But in the meantime, Burlington became the capital of Iowa Territory, and it kept that title for 3 years until 1841 when it was relocated west to Iowa City. On the 28th of December, 1846, Iowa was officially admitted into the Union as the 29th state. This was a part of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, a bill signed to preserve the balance of power between the slave states and the free states. Iowa, in this case, was admitted to the Union as a free state. Through the 1850s, Iowa's population tripled as more white settlers migrated into its fields, from just 212,000 in 1850 to 675,000 strong by 1860. This decade was marked by the Spirit Lake Massacre of 1857 between the white settlers of northwestern Iowa and the Dakota tribe of the Sioux. In 1861, the American Civil War began, which threatened to divide the U.S. and was extremely impactful to all of its states. And Iowa was no exception. They were an integral part of the Underground Railroad to Canada, and they sent 76.5 thousand soldiers to the South, which was the most of any state relative to their population. Although Iowa did not have any Jim Crow laws, it still mandated racial prejudice until the 40s. During the latter half of the 19th century, due to increased railway construction and the removal of natives to reservations, immigration increased as they settled in the prairies. By 1900, the population rose to a whopping 2.3 million. With the advent of barbed wire and the drainage of wetlands, this produced efficient agricultural productivity in the state, with maize forming a basis of it, as it was mainly used to feed livestock. When the USA joined the Great War in 1917, Iowa contributed over 114,000 soldiers in the battlefields of Europe, and the Camp Dodge encampment would be greatly expanded to be able to train the U.S. Army. Shortly after the war, in 1921, Iowa officially adopted this state flag, with the blue standing for loyalty, justice, and truth, the white standing for purity, and the red standing for honor. In the white column, there is also an eagle holding in its beak a ribbon with the state motto on it. And they signed their name at the bottom just in case you forgot whose flag it is. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, Iowa's agricultural economy collapsed, with the price of farm goods plummeting to record lows, to the point where by 1932, say, a pound of beef, a bushel of corn, or a dozen eggs only cost a few cents. This meant that farmers could no longer afford to maintain their farms and were foreclosed, leading to many Iowans losing their farms. This obviously angered Iowa's farmers and led them to organize strikes. During World War II, about 882,000 people were registered in the draft, with about 263,000 serving in some sort of branch in the armed forces. This is also a period when agricultural productivity skyrocketed because of the war effort. By 1945, Iowa's agricultural industry had a production value of over $1.2 billion, doubling from $582 million back in 1940. During the war, a few camps were established for prisoners of war, or were set up in Clarinda, Algona, and Eldora, keeping German and Italian war prisoners. When the war ended, around 8.4 thousand Iowan soldiers died. As the 20th century progressed, farming in Iowa thrived as higher productivity meant lower prices and more competition between farms. But this also meant that less successful farms got left behind and closed down, leading to fewer farms that were left to grow in size. As Iowa entered the 21st century, Iowa's economy diversified as the service industry took over. But Iowa still turned to its agricultural past as part of its identity. As well as its industry, its population and political stance also diversified as the Republican Party's dominant grip in Iowa began to fade. This was reflected when, in 2009, Iowa officially legalized same-sex marriage, 6 years before it was legal nationwide. So what can we take from Iowa's history? Sometimes, if you look into a region's history, even the blandest and most lifeless of them can have some of the most interesting stories hidden inside of them. I know, just corn. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe, and share this video with all of your friends. You can also click the notification bell so you don't miss a single video I upload. This is LaFinci, All Things History, signing out. Bye! Fun fact: the term emperor comes from the Latin word imperator, which means commander.